Tonight. Three huge stories going on in this country right now, and they're all connected. This is an in-depth CNN Tonight report. A special segment of our show, Outbreak, Crime, Protests, and COVID-19. America's living and dying through an unprecedented summer. The worsening pandemic, protests in the streets, and now a surge in crime. Tonight, we're taking a long, hard look at how these major stories are colliding with each other and impacting all of us. First, our regular habits and institutions crippled by the coronavirus, a virus that has been proven to impact communities of color and the black population specifically more than other Americans. Then the horrific death of George Floyd back in May as a Minneapolis police officer knelt on his neck, igniting protests nationwide. Americans demanding reforms in policing, an end to systemic racism and police brutality. Much of it aimed at black Americans. President Trump and his top aides hostile to the protests. Remember this? When he violently cleared peaceful protests so he could take a picture? Now crime is spiking in many of our cities for reasons we will explore and explain tonight on this program, while the president says this just a few hours ago.
Look at what's happened to New York. Crime is up, shootings are up, at numbers that nobody's ever seen before. Look at Chicago, what a disaster. And we're waiting for them to call us because we're all set to go. We have the FBI, we have Homeland Security, we have everybody ready to go. We have the National Guard, they're all ready to go.
But is this really the answer to getting the spikes in crime under control? In just a few moments, I'm going to speak to two top officials of the New York City Police Department, and we'll look at the expanding role of the Black Lives Matter movement. Among my guests tonight, Deputy Commissioner John Miller and Chief Jeffrey Maddrey of the NYPD. Kirsten John Foy, president and founder of Arc of Justice, a group that advocates for social and economic justice. CNN national correspondent Sarah Seidner, who extensively covered the protests in Minneapolis after George Floyd's death and race and police protests all over this country. And Charles Ramsey, the former police chief in Washington, D.C., who also served as Philadelphia's police commissioner. But first, here's CNN's Bryn Gingras on what's behind the spiking crime in America's cities.
14 shootings in 24 hours on New York City streets Monday, including the killing of a teenager shot in the head.
We are not going for this. So I'm talking to the streets. You know who's killing who?
A community outraged after a 1-year-old, while sitting in his stroller, was killed in a Brooklyn park. More gun violence is being felt in cities big and small, from coast to coast. In Seattle,
we are working very hard to reduce the number of shootings here in Seattle,
Chicago, Charleston, Philadelphia, Atlanta.
I hate to use the word a perfect storm, but it's where we are in this country right now.
In New York,
there has to be a price for carrying an illegal firearm in New York City, and right now the price isn't high enough.
The NYPD points to new recidivism data showing so far this year, police rearresting 1,452 individuals for major felonies. An offender who police say would otherwise likely be held in jail, but due to state bail reform laws which went into effect this year, were released. That's 771 more arrests of the same group than this time last year. On top of that, courts in New York and many states have not been fully operational because of coronavirus restrictions, meaning cases aren't being prosecuted quickly, grand juries aren't being convened, and there are limited jury selection procedures.
I'm going to weigh in on what's going on here. Like the mayor there in Atlanta said that it's a perfect storm. I'm the one that made mention of that about 2.5 months ago, whenever I foreseen all this coming down the pike, pertaining to shutting down basically the world, and then Donald Trump thinking that he was going to boot it back up like it was some sort of a computer or some sort of a light, like you turn it off and turn it on. Anytime you upset the apple cart this badly, to the point that you have major economical calamities pertaining to people not being able to feed their own families, pay their rent, keep their lights on, maintain their mortgage, maintain their car expenses on their automobile, you've got a recipe of catastrophe. You can add all that in with Black Lives Matter, police brutality, $25 trillion plus in debt, and almost 3 million people incarcerated in federal, state, and local jails. Now, how does it feel, Weakley County? How does it feel, West Tennessee? How does it feel, various people in the federal, state, and local governments, that you didn't want to support the windmill ministries? You didn't want peace. So consequently, if you don't want peace, that means you want chaos. All out of the anti-Juby movement. We went from the anti-Christ movement pertaining to crucifying our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ of Nazareth over in the Holy Land to now the anti-Juby movement that's been in the process for 30 plus years. This anti-Juby movement, this resistance movement, is what you're fixing to see unveil itself right in front of the world stage. Not only will it be in New York, not only will it be in Chicago, not only will it be in Washington, Seattle, Los Angeles, but it will be in every major corridor up into this land. And as the pandemic wreaks havoc on various communities, regardless whether it's summer or winter, regardless whether it's Florida or Houston, or Arizona or California, or even Tennessee. I think Tennessee spikes is going up right now. You will see these problems only intensify. This is a message going directly to the Neils. This is a message going directly to the people in Kenton, Tennessee. The Crosses. This is a message going directly to every law enforcement agency within a 200-mile perimeter. From Memphis, from Bowling Green to Chattanooga. You wanted this. Now you're going to receive it. And you're going to take it. Because if you can dish this shit out, you ought to be able to take it. You've dished out nothing but greed, selfishness, bigotry, hate, and everything but the godly thing in the past 30 plus years since I've been fighting against this resistance movement. This anti-Juby movement. That's exactly what it is. It's an anti-Juby movement. Well, now you're fixing to take it up the ass. Coming near a neighborhood near you. Just like the Walmart slogan. We may not make it to an election. If the countryside is turned totally upside down to the point that it's total chaos, we may not have an election. And to be quite honest with you, if the President of the United States ever declares a federal mandated martial law, which has been mandated one other time before during the Civil War of Abraham Lincoln. Now, there's been mandated places that got federal assistance in different times, like the Civil Rights Movement down in Alabama, down in places in Atlanta, the Rodney King riots out in California. There's been different times that the federal government had to step in with federal troops just to maintain law and order. But whenever this is going on state to state, shore to shore, from the Mexican border to the Canadian border, don't think for a second that the President of the United States, regardless of who he may be or she may be, has the power to declare mandated federal martial law upon to the people. Now, if this government can't figure out how other various presidencies handled things similar towards this, and I guess about the only thing that I can consider anything similar towards this would probably be during the Great Depression, the 1929 Depression, that stimulated soup lines, that stimulated rubber rationing on tires, gas rationing, and other types of rationing during that time to maintain law and order. If the government cannot figure out how to do this, then obviously they do not need to be part of the government. They need to resign, because as far as I'm concerned, whenever a government, local, state, or federal, can no longer provide safety and security to its own citizens, then is when you have to worry about an uprising. Then is when you have to worry about a coup d'etat. Then is when you have to worry about an overthrow. Whenever a government can no longer perform its duties as a civilized society to restrain and bring law and order and safety to its citizens, then is when you have to worry about something really, really big, really, really bad happening to our government, to various people in the government. Let me put it that way. And I'm going to sit back and I'm going to watch, because I've tried to warn them, I've tried to help them, I've tried to assist them. I ain't getting through to none of them. Still have yet to get any type of apology, formal or informal apology, from anybody in this area that was a part of all this, that was building since I come back here in 2014. I still have yet to get any type of formal or informal apology by the state of Tennessee pertaining to the governor of how that they banded me from all federal institutions. I still have yet to get an apology from the Oklahoma federal authorities pertaining to their governor and their lieutenant governor, pertaining to them planting a bomb in the back end of my truck and doing property damage after I went out and assessed the damage and went and got 3 estimates and took my case before City Hall and was denied any type of help. You know, I just got through explaining that today to Mr. Pat Burns, that is now working as a chairman for another town in the same state. Explaining to him that $4,000 camper, I could, hypothetically speaking, go to Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and start busting out federal, state-run windows, or sabotaging or vandalizing various things in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, that would cost the departments of whoever that I was picking on, that ultimately would cost the taxpayers in Oklahoma. It would for darn sure cost the taxpayers in the city of Oklahoma, but may very well cost the taxpayers in the state of Oklahoma. May not be as much, but it could still very well cost, depending upon how much damage. But you know, that's exactly what my enemy would love for me to do. My enemy would love for me to bow down on the same level that my enemy's been playing on all this time, and me, myself, and I go seek restitution. But I've been smarter than that. I'm a cold cucumber whenever it comes to what the play game is. And the play game is this. The Bible says, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. The Bible says, God works in mysterious ways. The Bible tells me for me to be wise as serpents, but harmless as doves. And until I feel like that I'm involved in a direct threat, either on my property, in my home, or even away from my property, until I feel like that I'm involved in a direct threat towards somebody going to do physical bodily harm to me, the only thing that I can do is sit back and laugh and grin and bear all this. But now, as soon as I know that somebody is bold enough to want to advance their violence upon my body, then is whenever there will be serious repercussions upon whoever decides to do any foolish thing like this. So far, they've just been poking, punching, agitating, provoking, name calling, setting me up, been backstabbed by family members, been backstabbed by friends in the neighborhood, been backstabbed, betrayed by all these law enforcement agencies around here after preaching this message for 30 plus years. So whatever befalls upon this great nation, and I don't want it to befall upon this great nation, but whatever befalls upon this great nation, they had it coming. The fault falls upon the feet of those that was part of this conspiracy. This resistance movement that even whenever I moved back here, it was game on. Has it slacked off a little bit? A little. It's backed off a little bit. It's not quite as aggressive as what it was, but that doesn't give me no blank check or guarantee that it won't open back up tomorrow and me have a group full of idiots riding up and down the road whistling and beeping their horns and calling me all kinds of slanderous names and vandalizing my property and trying to get away with murder. And of course, as long as you have your law enforcement, judicial system that permits for this type of activity, why would you not have them out here doing that? The only thing that has stopped it is God has demonstrated His divine power is what has stopped it. So now I got an oxymoron going on. It's bittersweet. It's a two-edged sword. They've left me alone to some extent. But every time I drive down the road or I pull up in a gas station or I go to Walmart, I get some of the hatefulest, evilest looks of people shooting daggers at me because they know exactly who I am and what I stand for. rather than them being friendly and trying to make up for what has occurred, now they're being standoffish, sure enough, and treating me like I'm the plague. Do you not think that the generation that was growing up during Jesus' time that he was preaching the gospel done Jesus Christ the very same way? You have a very, very superstitious group of people around here that still mark crosses on their windshields if a black cat pulls in front of them while driving. Refuses to walk under a ladder. You got so many old superstitious ways around here that it's not even funny in the Bible Belt area. That to me is all just a bunch of silly, willy nonsense. But as we sit and watch the destruction, as Satan is demonstrating his powers, just has been predicted towards him rising up in the last days, because he knoweth his time is short, with great wrath. As we watch these things unfold on TV, keep in mind not to blame the messenger. The messenger done his part towards putting out the message to the American people, going from county to county, from state to state, from place to place. During which time I was vulnerable, and they picked, probed, violated, agitated, demonized, and dehumanized the messenger for doing so. So the messenger, since 2014, decided to come back to his home. Come back to roost. Regroup, dig in, settle down, and watch the very hand of God take place as these idiots are swarming, running, fighting, shooting, killing, stealing, robbing, raping, and all the above. Let's watch the rest of this. Congratulations to our local law enforcement agencies, including those up in the land between the lakes and Oklahoma and Atlanta and Washington, D.C., for opening up the genie and letting the genie out of the bottle. In other words, Pandora's box has been opened. And to shut it right now, with the pandemic still raging in various places, and the job situation being as bleak as what I mean, just yesterday I heard where they was putting India, as many people as in India, which is 1 billion and something, put it on a 2-week lockdown. Brazil is in a bad way. Other countries are being blasted again with the second wave, or maybe it's just part of the first wave. This is far from being over. The Bible says that as you shall see the days approaching, that no flesh shall be saved. But for the elect's sake whom he has chosen, he will shorten those days. He will shorten the days. That as you shall see the days approaching, that no flesh shall be saved. Put that in your pipe and smoke it, West Tennessee. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. All these governors and all these lieutenants, captains, all these FBI agents, all these Secret Service agents, all these other law enforcement agents that wanted to stifle, destroy, eradicate the messenger because they did not like the message coming from the messenger. They didn't want to listen to the messenger towards putting him in center stage of the limelight. They favored more towards your fake preachers, your false teachers, your ear ticklers, your tongue talkers. Well, as people are dying, gurgling in their own blood, I wonder how many of them will be speaking in tongues, looking for an interpreter of trying to figure out what the hell is going on. I've known what was going on for 30 plus years, but there wasn't a darn thing that I could do about it other than sit and watch it materialize right in front of my very eyes. And now, consequently, we are all going to have to ultimately pay some sort of price, beginning with the Reagans and the Bushes that decided that they was going to overpower and undermine God and God's precious people up onto this planet. Coming near a neighborhood near you. Please listen.
The absence of courts operating, and when people aren't coming through the courts, we're not seeing the same level of debriefings that are traditionally part of the kind of police work that we rely on to be able to respond to violent crime and often enables prevention.
A spokesperson for the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, the borough which saw most of the shootings Monday, told CNN, quote, "For us, the biggest issue is there are no grand juries, so we can't indict felony cases."
March hard. Not just for police brutality. Do this for this black on black. It could be your child.
In the wake of George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis, protesters cried out coast to coast for changes in policing and the defunding of departments. The demands met with swift reform. On Tuesday, Pennsylvania following in New York's footsteps, the governor signing 2 measures into law which address the hiring of officers and increases their training, including for implicit bias.
Let me say this very clearly. Black lives matter. I'll say it again. Black lives matter. But saying it, that's just not enough. We must listen and we must take action.
Across America, the continuous criticism and reform measures said to be weighing on the rank and file.
If you're out on the streets and every time you turn on television, they're saying how much they hate you and how much they don't need you and how unimportant you are to the safety of your citizens, it does a lot for their morale.
Over a 1-week period at the beginning of this month, NYPD retirements soared more than 400% compared to the same week last year. A detective who is considering retirement told CNN, "Every day the pension section sends out a notice of who went that day and filed. It used to be a page, maybe 2 at the most. The other day, it was 6 pages." Meanwhile, departments are striving to do better, knowing how vital it is to build relationships with the communities they serve. The NYPD instituting changes within, including assigning a new head to community affairs with the task of reimagining community policing.
When people start talking about issues of systemic racism and police brutality, these are the hard conversations that I'm prepared to take on, that I will take on it.
But in the end, experts say it needs to be all hands on deck to turn this alarming trend around, from police to courts to communities. Bryn Gingras, CNN, New York.
Now I want to bring in John Miller. John Miller is NYPD's Deputy Commissioner for Intelligence and Counterterrorism and Chief Jeffrey Madry of the NYPD's Community Affairs Bureau. Gentlemen, I'm so happy to have both of you on. Thank you so much for doing this. It is really important. Deputy Commissioner Miller, I'm going to start with you. New York is losing its status as one of the safest big cities in the country, spiking murders. Tell me why. What is happening right now in New York?
I want to say this. Getting back to my $4,000 hard shell camper that the officials in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma blowed up. Ruined it. Right in front of all their cameras with their $100,000 robot. I used an analogy for a hypothetical. What if I wanted to get back at the Oklahoma authorities and go down there and start tearing up a bunch of stuff and burning down buildings? What if people that has been hurt, abused by the system, taken advantage of, used, set up, either been put in jail or having to pay all these fines as pertaining to probation of this wicked demonic system that is now God is bringing transparency towards how wicked and demonic that it truly is. What if all those people decided that they was going to go take out an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? You have to wonder why people are doing what they're doing with all this violence towards tearing up all this stuff. And my point that I'm trying to make is this. You know, I really think the officials love to see it whenever it's black on black or crime on crime. Because it's that much more or less paperwork that they have to deal with, and it's that much more problems that the taxpayers have to deal with. If you're going to beat the horse, don't you think you need to beat him on the right end? Don't beat him on the end that you know ain't going to have no effect. If you're going to have an effect with these rich, wealthy, well-to-do people that are now sitting back drawing their big $2,000, $2,500, $4,500, maybe $6,000 pensions and benefits a month, living in their nice homes, driving their nice cars, being treated like kings and queens. If you're going to cause grief and despair in these people's lives, you need to beat the horse on the other end. You don't need to attack each other. Attacking each other is what these criminal extortionists want. That's exactly what they want. But now whenever people starts going after judges and prosecuting attorneys and lawyers and other high-end law enforcement agencies, then we might see a turnaround pertaining to all this abuse that's going on, pertaining to police brutality. Once more, the Bible is very clear. Once God gets enough of it, he said that he would give the people over to a reprobate mind and allow for them to believe a lie and to be damned. That he would allow for the wicked to turn upon to the wicked. The same thing has happened in other cultures. The same thing has happened in other generations. Where whenever God gets enough of it, he will pick up that umbrella of protection and say, okay, Satan, do your job. Sick 'em. And don't think for a second that he won't be like a raging lion, seeking who he may, out to kill, steal, and destroy, just like the good book talks about. Because if you'll take him off that leash, son, I guarantee you, he'll show you what destruction and pain and remorse and agony is about. And that's what God has done. He has taken Lucifer off the leash. And now, according to the Bible, Lucifer is rising up in society because he knows he has lost in the competition. And it's just a matter of time before he's going to have to pay his time towards being thrown into hell. And that will basically be the death and destruction and any type of future influences from Satan will be eradicated. So he knows that his clock is ticking, and it's ticking backwards, and it's getting closer every tick. And now Satan is finally acknowledging this, and now we're seeing it being displayed all over this country and all over this world. That's what's happening. That's exactly what's happening. In other words, we ain't seen nothing yet. Because between the dirty politicians, the rotten preachers, the spineless society that I've been seeing pick and poke along towards thinking everybody owes them a living, if you'll combine that with all this other stuff, you, just like the mayor of Atlanta said, you have a perfect storm. A perfect storm.
You know, Don, you make a really interesting point there, because we're not one of those cities, and you've named a few in those stories, that was plagued with violence. If you go back a year ago, we were the place that re-engineered policing in a complex city of 8.6 million people, where not only was crime going down, but at the same time, we had broken a lot of the old theories. Well, if arrest goes up, crime goes down. If you make more stops, you get more guns. By doing what we call precision policing, which is clearly focused, we had crime going down while arrests were going down, while our issuing of summonses was going down. And the benefits were civilian complaints against police were going down. Use of force was going down. Our use of firearms by our police officers was the lowest national average among major cities. Everything was trending in the right direction. And then what you see is sea changes that came very suddenly. A package of 5 or 6 laws, bail reform, discovery rules that said victims and witnesses' names would be handed over to defendants' lawyers within a matter of weeks of the arrests. Even people who called 911 raised the age for juvenile offenders. Look, Don, the criminal justice system is a complex ecosystem. If you make a change here, you have to make an adjustment there. That was an awful lot of changes, not small ones, but big ones, that happened all at once. You throw in COVID behind that, you have a real problem. So right now, if you want the good story, our overall crime is down. That's good news. You want the bad news, our shootings are up. And when you're America's safest large city, and your shootings are going up to levels you haven't seen since 1995, you have to ask why. And I'm sure in this discussion we'll get to those whys. Yeah. But we've got the numbers and we've got a lot of the causes.
So let me ask, before I bring Chief Maddrey in, so then what are you saying? You're saying this all, many of the changes that you said took place at the first of the year, right, John?
Yeah.
Okay. So are you saying those changes should have happened, should not have happened, or we should have thought about it more, or it should have? It was too much at once. What are you saying here, John?
So the NYPD has long been a place that embraces reforms, but in a sensible way. So each one of those changes in the law were something that we could have adjusted to. Again, it's a complex system. You turn one dial up here, you turn one down there, with minor adjustments and changes to the law. Instead, the state legislature pushed all these laws through as one big package without consulting law enforcement, and when law enforcement pushed their ideas forward, no changes were made to those laws. So they were passed as a package. Now they've gone back and made a couple of adjustments to one of those laws, but
not the ones that are going to be helpful in this. So doing something this drastic has to be a collaborative process, one with legislators on the state, city council members in the city, prosecutors and police at a table where they'd say, this is the change we want to make. How do we make it work so we don't have an unintended consequence? And that is what didn't happen. Thank you, John, for that. Chief Madry, again, thank you so much for being here. I'm so grateful. So I want to play something for you before I get you to respond. This is Police Chief Terrence Monahan. He spoke to 1010 WINS Radio here in New York today. He talked about the plainclothes and anti-crime unit being disbanded. Listen to this.
There is a feeling on the street that the police are handcuffed, that they are not out there as aggressively as we were in the past. The new law that was passed by the city council has cops hesitant. They are fearful that they may be arrested if they take some proactive type enforcement. The disbanding of anti-crime obviously has a huge effect. Those are our best cops out on the street grabbing guns, so there's a feeling that it's safe to carry a gun on the street. So we are looking for ways to change that mentality out on the streets by getting different units out there focusing on the guns that are on the streets right now.
So, Chief Madry, I want to know what you think of what Chief Monahan said, and also respond to John, but do you believe criminals are emboldened right now following the protests and the increased scrutiny on police? Do you think that criminals are emboldened?
I do, Don. Our anti-crime unit being disbanded, a lot of the conversation you hear in the street now, where the police are being attacked, the police are being disrespected and denigrated, it's having an effect on the officers. Our anti-crime unit was the one unit that went out there and took on the most dangerous job in this department, going out there trying to find people who are carrying illegal guns. So that unit being disbanded, of course, hurts the morale of those officers who are doing the job and other officers in the department. But I mean, the NYPD is a resilient department.
Go get Dwayne Camry, badge number 1414. It used to be the chief or the captain in Land Between the Lakes. Go get the Hawkins family and go get the LBL law enforcement agencies. They'll save you. They're the ones that made my life miserable. Get the people up in Calvert City and Paducah, Kentucky, Grand Rivers, Benton, Calvert, and other areas around there that was sticking out their chest a few years ago towards trying to bury an individual. They'll save you. Go up there to Dresden. Get the Dresden Sheriff's Department. Get all their deputies out. They'll save you. Get the people over in Kenton. People over in Martin. Get them deputies. They'll save you. There's been too much dirty dealing going on. And if it went on in my life the way that it's went on in the past 30 years that I can prove, that's the reason why that we're seeing what we're seeing right now of people playing the game, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You take all these families that don't have no jobs, that was already living paycheck to paycheck, that little stimulus check that they got, that was only a drop in the bucket compared to what they actually need. Do you think that the federal government is getting off their asses right now towards producing another stimulus check to prevent from this gun violence from slowing it down and this lawlessness from occurring? I haven't heard of it. Every now and then you may hear of a little bit about a stimulus, but I don't see nothing serious about no stimulus. Once more, have I had anybody knocking on my door apologizing to me pertaining to the founder of the Windmill Ministries? Nope. That's the reason whenever they're dying off, the way that they're dying off, I refuse to go to the funerals. Because I know whenever I do, somebody's probably going to show their ass, and whenever they show their ass, they're going to try to make it look like it was me. So I just don't even go. Give them a gift, send them a postcard, send them a flower, whatever. And just sit back and watch. Because they have brought this upon themselves.
find ways to adjust. And we're going to go out there and continue the job and try and keep people safe and keep our community safe.
But you know, Chief,
You gonna what? You gonna try? Is that why they're taking 44% out of my check every week? So that somebody can tell me they're gonna try to be there for my protection in case somebody's breaking in my house? Is that the reason why that we're paying all this money for all these dividends being taken out? So that we can have people tell us we'll try to protect you. We'll try to take care of you. We'll try to keep people from hacking into your bank account and stealing your identity, Dennis. It's a joke.
shooting incidents were already up in 2020 by over 20% when the NYPD Commissioner Shea announced last month that he was disbanding NYPD's anti-crime unit. So is this about shifting mentality on the streets, or is this or something else?
Well, of course, it shifts the mentality on the street because the officers who were out there doing the job, who a lot of the bad guys and the bad actors knew, they know that they're not out there doing that job anymore, that they're not performing those duties anymore. But, you know, public safety is an ecosystem, and we have to call everybody to the table to be responsible. All the city agencies, all the community-based organizations, they all have to play a part in public safety. Anti-crime being disbanded is just one portion of it. All city agencies, all elected officials, all leaders, we all play a part in this ecosystem of public safety. We have to reduce unnecessary criminal justice contacts with many members of the community, but we at the same time have to increase public safety. And I think this is part of what we have to do now in New York City.
Okay, so Deputy Commissioner, let me bring you back in here because, and this is something news that happened today I want you to respond to. The president saying that he has the National Guard and others ready to jump in. Are his remarks helpful? Does the NYPD need outside help from the National Guard or outside help at all?
So we don't need help from the National Guard. It's not that we don't have the requisite manpower for basic policing, and the National Guard wouldn't know what to do in these cases anyway. His other comments about working with Homeland Security, we work with Homeland Security investigations. We work very closely with the FBI on violent crime and gangs. We're doing all that already. Our problem is not going to be solved with soldiers with rifles on the street. Our problem is going to be solved when you're making gun arrests. If 40% of those people arrested with a gun, a loaded firearm, are being released on their own recognizance, even though a gun charge was not covered by the bail reform law that said you couldn't remand people or require bail there. When 80% of them are being released on their own recognizance in Brooklyn, where we have the most shootings, when you've got hundreds of cases that haven't been indicted because the grand juries aren't sitting, and that's due to COVID. But when you have a system where even the people who are convicted of those cases, which is only 17% of our disposed of cases, meaning it went to trial, there was a guilty plea, it ended, only 17% of our cases are getting disposed of. And in those cases where there's a mandatory minimum of 1 to 3 years, people are doing an average of 9 months. That's really sending a message to the people in the street. A, the likelihood is I'm not going to get stopped. I'm not going to be arrested. If I am arrested, I have an 80% chance in some places and a 50% chance in others that I'm getting out right that day. And if I even plead guilty or get convicted, I'm only going away for 9 months. That is not a formula that discourages gun violence, which is markedly unfair. The thing that's unfair about the gun violence is, and the irony of the time that we're talking about this in is, you know, in our June, July numbers, 95 to 100% of our shooting victims were minorities, that's blacks and Hispanics. In 1 month, 100% of our murder victims were. This is having a disparate effect on certain communities And we are not getting the same reaction from the press or the politicians about that disparate effect that we are about other things.
Whoever has a key, sorry, Commissioner.
That's okay.
Yeah, sorry, finish your thought, please, because I couldn't hear you for the last about 30 seconds. Go on.
Well, the disparate effect I was describing, Don, is the vast majority of the victims of this violence are in New York's communities of color.
Yeah.
In some cases, 100%, depending on what period and numbers you look at. That's devastating, and we're not having the same pitch and tone of outrage from our politicians, or frankly our media, about those woundings and deaths that we are about all the other issues that are at the forefront here. Yeah. I'm not saying that we need to have one conversation and not the other, but it's very hard to separate these conversations when you see the effect it's having on lives.
Well, John, as you know, that's the reason I contacted you, because there's real concern out there, and quite frankly, I'm hearing from people who said, I have a friend who said I was mugged for the first time in New York City since the 1970s.
So, it's interesting, Don, because since I've been sitting here with you, we had a 16-year-old shot in the Bronx. We had a 19-year-old shot on the Upper West Side. We had another teenager mugged at gunpoint by a group of other teenagers in Central Park. This is not the New York that we were talking about a few months ago. This is a different situation, and there are fixes. And your friend's story resonates.
Yeah. Chief Maddrey, listen, I want to bring you in, and I want to continue to talk about. I want to talk about the COVID thing, and then talk about the real elephant in the room here, right? The whole defunding the police and so on and so forth. But let's talk about the impact of COVID, because John mentioned this before. What is the impact of coronavirus on policing? Are you seeing a connection between the spikes in certain crime and the pandemic?
Well, the pandemic exposed a lot of things. I mean, first of all, when you look at the effects of the pandemic, you're talking about economic distress with families. You're talking about hunger, food deprivation, loss of loved ones and treasured icons. And then, of course, a lot of our institutions being closed, our houses of worship, other places that people frequent to just, to relax and be able to unwind after working. And work itself, jobs were shut down. So the pandemic had a great effect on New York City. It had a great effect on the police department. The police department, many members of the police department were exposed to COVID-19, and they suffered through COVID-19. Their families suffered through COVID-19. And all those effects that I mentioned, economic distress, lost their loved ones, a lot of members of the police department suffered through that. But when you talk about COVID and the public health crisis it caused, gun violence is also a public health crisis, and it should be viewed as a public health crisis. And we're seeing gun violence just explode right now in the city. And we have to treat it as a public health crisis, and we have to look at it with a holistic approach of how we're going to address it, with community partners, strategically working together to help reduce gun violence, to help shut down the iron pipeline. When talking on a bigger scale, the iron pipeline with guns is still coming into the city at an alarming rate. And when we talk about all those strategic partners, people that can help us from a holistic standpoint of providing resources and helping young people or people who wish to do gun violence, at the end of the day, when people are ready to go out there and pull the trigger, we need to make sure we're supporting our police so they can do a dangerous job as well and remove those people off the street who wish to hurt people through gun violence.
John, let's dig into this a little bit more, because you have, when it comes to COVID, right, you have people who are being let out of jail, right, or who are being released because they don't want to be exposed to, they don't want them exposed to COVID, and then you have a court system, right, you talked about this a little bit before, where people aren't going to court, they're having to make adjustments. And all of this is playing into the people who are out on the streets. And quite honestly, many of them, for whatever reason, not to stigmatize, but are not necessarily stable or the best of citizens. And that is contributing to the issue. I know that there is real fear out there among citizens of New York. Can you talk to me about that and how COVID plays into that?
So sure. You know, at the beginning of the year, we probably had 5,400 people in the Rikers Island jail, which is the city's prison. At the same time, the state was making a giant push to get people out on parole. So they were paroling as many people as possible to reduce the state jail population. Now, when you go on parole, you have to say you're going to live somewhere. A lot of those people don't have resources to set that up outside. So many of them were paroled into New York City's homeless shelters. Then you had COVID come along, and then you had a further push. So right now, the population at Rikers Island is about 3,000, maybe a little less, prisoners. That's a prison that once held 20,000 people, but that was a long time ago. You know, we have been through reducing reducing that population. But when you enter COVID into it, now you have hundreds of people being released into the streets. Then you have people being rearrested who are not going back to jail. You have people who, there aren't the grand juries to indict those cases as the law requires. So, you know, if you take our gun cases, 50% of them are indicted, 50% of them are unindicted. Who knows what's going to occur in those cases? Then you have this other factor, Don, which is really important. The NYPD, like the rest of the populace, was hit hard by COVID. So at some point you have 7,000 cops who are out sick. And then you see shootings start to rise in neighborhoods around the city where crime is down, fewer people are on the streets, crime and police calls for service, or everything was slowing down. Why were shootings going up? And that started during COVID because police presence was lower, the challenges for the cops were greater, and the criminal justice system was starting to grind to a halt. And we're still in the residual effects of that.
You know, Chief, John mentioned fixes, okay? So let's talk about those. New York's policing strategies of the past are well known, with broken windows, stop and frisk. Now the new term is precision policing. Talk to me about that. What is precision policing?
Well, precision policing is really about knowing who's out there, who the bad actors are, who's committing the gun violence and the most crime. A small percentage of people will commit the most crime in the city, and make sure we're directing our resources to those people. And again, like I said, we're going to need a holistic approach, even with precision policing, through strategic partnerships and working with our community members and allowing our police officers to do their job, a very difficult job. And they need support in doing that job.
Okay, I want you to stand by, gentlemen. We're going to continue to talk about this, but what does this surge in crime mean for the Black Lives Matter movement? Here to discuss now is Kirsten John Foy. Kirsten John Foy is the president and founder of Arc of Justice. Kirsten, thank you. I appreciate you joining me this evening. You've been listening to this, and we're talking about the big spikes in violence in several cities. How is that affecting communities of color and the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, let's thank you, Don, and good evening to Chief Madry and Commissioner Miller. It's having a chilling effect. In fact, I've done several vigils where the narrative and the message coming out of these violent and horrific acts is Black Lives Matter. And we're not directing that at an external force like the NYPD or other law enforcement. We are directing that message internally. We cannot be hypocrites about the preservation and the importance of preserving Black life. We can't demand that others respect Black life, and we won't do so within our own community. But I just want to address, there was many things that was said that I think is worth addressing. When you have a hammer, everything is a nail. And for the police to recognize that gun violence is a public health crisis, yet the only prescription that they have offered are criminal justice prescriptions, means that the ecosystem of public safety that they're referring to is not whole. We need to not just be addressing this current epidemic and scourge of gun violence with criminal justice tools. We need to apply other tools that we have in our toolbox. We just, in the city of New York, zeroed out on top of COVID shutting down all recreation for young people during the summer, we just had the budget zeroed out summer youth employment programs. That was the initial salvo in the budgetary negotiation. So youth-based and youth-targeted austerity, I believe, was one of the triggers and the catalysts for what we are seeing. Our young people are hungry and thirsty. They have been sheltered in place for months. Remote learning in many instances has failed them. Many of our young people, elders in high school, have checked out. And summer youth employment was their go-to. It was the thing they were looking forward to. And so when the mayor and others came out initially and said, we're not going to have any summer youth employment at all in this city, it sent a chilling effect. And so you had gangs and other so-called bad actors exploit that reality, target our young people who are now desperate, who are hopeless, who are feeling rejected and dejected, now given a sense that they have someplace to belong. They have a purpose, if nefarious, so be it, but they have a purpose. People are saying, well, if the government's not there to put money in your pocket, don't worry about it. We'll figure it out. Just rock with us for the summertime. So we are seeing, let me just finish and then you can pick it up. We are seeing the perfect storm of social phenomena converging on this point. But to address all of it with criminal justice and law enforcement to the exclusion of fully funding some summer youth activity, even if it's virtually, the failure to think outside of the box, the failure to anticipate the impact of COVID, the impact of remote learning failures, the impact of this public health crisis on our young people, that failure of imagination, that failure of leadership is what led us to this point.
So, Kirsten, I want to, so people who are watching at home, and my family members among them, and people I know who, I live in New York City, I live in Harlem, and I just got, my neighbors are texting me now saying, listen, I'm watching your show. It's not just guns, knife violence, stabbings, slashings are happening all the time, 3 to 4 times a day in West and Central Harlem, as per my Citizen app. More scary than guns for me, at least. People are going to wonder, Kirsten, how does, a youth program, and it is needed, and what you said, how does that drive people? They go from that to a gun, to killing someone, to stabbing someone.
Well, we touched on it earlier, Don. This is a public health crisis. Many of our young people are suffering from trauma that's inflicted by violence, trauma that originates out of poverty, the conditions that they live under, the absence of adequate housing, the absence of opportunities, whether they be educational or employment opportunities, the presence of violence. We may have seen a decrease in the stats, but on the streets, those stats they rarely play out the way they play out in a presentation in a boardroom. And so our people are dealing with this untreated trauma. And then on top of that, they are told that the little opportunities that they were looking forward to will no longer be there. So instead of saying, let's throw the police at this, like we threw the police at social distancing enforcement inappropriately, and that wound up in a fracture of the good faith that took years to build up. It looked like a resurgence, a reemergence, and a resurrection of stop and frisk under a new policy, social distancing enforcement. When we see the police doing jobs that they are not trained to do, that they are not equipped to do, that quite frankly won't get to the core of the problem, we see criminal justice and law enforcement exacerbating the problem.
Okay. All right, let me bring in. I understand. I think we got it. So, but I want to bring in Chief Maddrey. Can you respond to him? He makes some really good points about what's happening, people not having anything to do, the conditions that many people are set in. But do you see that as Is that part of the issue here?
Absolutely. When you look at a lot of our communities that have been marginalized and underfunded and don't have the resources, of course it's going to play into it. Of course it's a factor. And you know, we need our leaders, we need government and everyone involved to address it. This is what I talk about. We need a holistic approach to address crime in our communities with our community-based organizations and our churches, our house of worships, of our crisis management systems. All of these entities have to work together. We have to formalize the police community response to how we address crime. But also at the same time, when we see this uptick in gun violence, we still need the police to be the police and address these crimes.
John, you know, I want you to respond, because if you're just sort of being reductive and simplistic about it, you would say, well, you know, because this happened right in this moment, then that means this and that means this. What Kirsten is talking about is something that has been happening for a long time, something that should have been anticipated. How do you see what Kirsten says playing into the crisis that we're dealing with right now?
I'm having trouble disagreeing with anything that Kirsten Foy says. You know, I even agree with him on the hammer and nail analogy. You know, this is the deal with police, Don. Society has a series of safety nets. There's health, there's youth services, there's mental health services. But throughout history, whenever those safety nets have become worn or broken or had holes in them, when people start to fall through them, at the bottom, there's always a cop. That's where that ends up, whether it's mental health, the homeless, and so on. So when it comes to shooting, if the nail is the bullet, then police are going to be the hammer. We're going to focus on that, and our focus is going to be enforcement. But Kirsten's point is extraordinarily important. When it comes to youth, you know, we have a police commissioner, Dermot Shea, who, when he was sworn in, his state of the NYPD address was, my focus is going to be on the kids. How do we keep them from going down that road? How do we put them on a better road? How do we help them, you know, in neighborhoods where they have very limited choices? And he started the Youth Coordination Officer program. He hired a deputy commissioner and said, your job is to wrangle other city agencies into services that they're not providing, whether that's cleaning up that park or opening up that youth center or providing that services. We have something called Operation Ceasefire, and Jeff Madry, Chief Madry, can tell you all about that, where we went to the homes of kids who we thought, this kid is with a gang, he's involved in shootings, and there would be an intervention with a member of the clergy, a member of the kid's family, a member of the police department, maybe a probation officer, and said, these are your choices. The next shooting from this gang, you know, you may be involved in that and your choices are limited. But right now, can we steer you towards a job? You want a job? We'll get you one. Can we steer you towards a training program? You want training? We'll get you one. Are you having an addiction issue? Do you want rehab? Do you want a program? We can get you into one. You can write your ticket here, but you're headed to a bad place. So as the hammer, that's what police tend to be in these things. You know, we've tried a whole bunch of different tools, but we're not really the answer. Mr. Foy is right. Those programs need to be empowered. They need to be emboldened. And those safety nets, they need to have those holes fixed. The problem that we're facing right now is we have a crime surge, which requires more cops, and we're about to have less, and requires better deployments and more deployments. And our overtime budget has been cut by 60%. Not the kind of thing that works logistically in a surge, and it was largely kind of in the politics of all of the protest movement to say we're doing something to punish the NYPD by defunding. That's also not what you do during a crime surge, because for every one of these crimes, there's a victim back there, one who may be surviving, one who may be losing their life. But that's where we're supposed to be focused and where we're needed right now, and that's a resource issue.
Yeah. Well, listen,
and like I said a while ago, if the government, the United States federal government, cannot handle these type of demands that eventually weed themselves down to smaller state governments, county state governments, If they can't handle this, then this government has failed to provide safety and security for its good, civilized society. That is horrible. To think that we are going back to a third world banana republic state to the point of being like Honduras or some of these other smaller countries, that our United States government cannot provide safety and security for its own citizens. It's absolutely horrifying. It's horrifying in even imagining that this is going on in New York, much less going on all over the country.
We can talk all evening about defunding the police and what it means and so on and so forth, but I want to bring Kirsten back in, because I wanted you to hear what they had to say. Now I want you to respond to it. And in your response, I want to ask you this, because Black Lives Matter now has a lot of people behind it, right? A Pew Research poll last month saying 67% of Americans support the movement. Do you think that this crime surge might jeopardize that support? And then respond to what the gentleman said there.
I hope it doesn't jeopardize the support that's being built around racial equity and equality in this country. I think it's important to keep in mind and to put in context what we are seeing. And I count Chief Maddrey as a friend. Commissioner Miller, I know, is a good man. And I'm glad we're all having an embarrassment of agreement here tonight. But I think it's important to maintain the grander context of what is happening here. We have reached our saturation point with respect to guns. There is a gun for every man, woman, and child in this country. And when it is easier for a young person who is feeling a sense of despair, hopelessness, when it is easier for them to get their hands on a gun than it is to get their hands on an application for a job, or to get their hands on an application for a training program, then that is a recipe for disaster. I think it's important to note that we have seen over the years, we have seen a market shift in the way the NYPD operates. Some of us wish we had seen more, but I think the defunding the NYPD movement was not about punishing the police. It's not, for some of us, it wasn't about being punitive. It was about the redirecting of critical resources away from the law enforcement apparatus and the law enforcement approach to the public health infrastructure, the crisis management system, as Chief Maddrey mentioned. The fact that we do not have in our schools guidance counselors, the fact that our children are going to bed hungry and waking up hungry in many instances, the fact that there have been no playgrounds open, no parks open, the fact that our children have been boxed in by circumstance and by material reality, and now they are boxed in by a lack of hope for any opportunity. All of these things go into what we are seeing with this crime spree. And I would hope that everyone that believes that Black Life Matters holds these truths close to them. That if Black Life Matters is not just a tag after a killing, it's also a call to action to prevent the circumstances, to arrest the social ills that are driving these young people and engulfing these young people, and to give our young people a sense that there is a pathway out of this reality, and we do not currently have that.
Yeah. Listen, I'm so glad that we're all here talking about this. Because it is a very difficult conversation. But also, I think that what we're doing here is a responsible way of having this, instead of relegating it to a political process or some other means, trying to demonize people, demonize the cops, or demonize Black Lives Matter, or demonize anyone, because we all need each other.
We do. But it first starts at home, like this guy said. You got to have a pathway to show these kids that there is another solution other than getting out on the street and being a gangbanger. That's where the fortunate, that's where the rich, that's where the powerful, that's where the pillars of the communities have failed, because they have greeted selfishly all what was left, and now there ain't nothing left. So whose fault is it? Where does the fault fall upon? It falls upon the adults. It falls upon the leadership. It falls upon the rich. It falls upon the elderly. It falls upon the success of the pillars of the community. That's who it falls upon. That's exactly who it falls upon. The selfish, the greedy, because there is no other avenue that a lot of these children are looking at. There is no second best alternative between the lesser of the two evils. It's bad, man. I'm telling you, it's bad.
The cops need the citizens on board. The citizens need the police officers on board. It works both ways. So thank you, gentlemen. I want you to all stand by. We're going to continue to talk about this, and hopefully, I don't want to run out of time. I want to talk about defund the police a little bit more. You know, as these three stories of crime, protest.
I'm going to stop right there, because defunding the police is not the answer to this problem. The problem is going back and doing thy first works over again. The problem is getting it right spiritually, so God will enable us to know how to handle these situations. Right now, we're just sailing in the storm. We're sailing in the dark. And instead of us getting away from the storm, the eye of the storm, we're actually getting closer to the belly of the beast. So I'm going to end this where it is. It's a very enlightening conversation, and it does need to be talked about, not just in New York, but in Chicago and Atlanta, Washington State, Los Angeles, and all these other places. But I go back to the core of origin, towards what went on in 1980 and 8. That's just my view on it. Have a good day. Thanks for listening. Good luck to all of us.